Before we begin, a mandatory disclaimer for our audience. The following story is a work of fiction for entertainment purposes. Although set within a real historical context, the characters and dialogues are fictional and do not represent factual or documentary accounts. Have you ever looked at the sun setting over the Pacific and wondered what lies beneath that endless shimmering blue shroud? We talk about legends, about monsters of the deep that haunted the maps of ancient mariners, but I can tell you that the most terrifying thing ever to sail those waters wasn't a myth born of sailors' rum. It was made of 72,000 tons of cold, uncompromising steel, and fueled by the desperate burning pride of a dying empire. They called it the Yamato. It was more than a ship. It was the largest battleship ever conceived by the mind of man, a floating fortress so massive that it seemed to bend the very horizon when it moved, a titan that made every other vessel in the world look like a mere bathtub toy. To the Japanese, it was the embodiment of their spirit, the floating soul of Nippon. To those of us on the other side, it was a ghost, a whispered nightmare that we spent years trying to find in the vast, humid expanse of the ocean. But here's the haunting truth that history often brushes over. How does the most powerful weapon in the world spend the greatest war in history doing almost nothing, only to vanish in a final suicidal scream of fire? How does a giant built to rule the waves become a silent tomb for 3,000 men in a matter of hours? I was there in 1945, flying through a sky that had turned into a wall of lead, and I still see that massive, jagged silhouette in my dreams every time the wind picks up from the west. My name doesn't carry any weight in the history books. I'm just another old man in a faded flight jacket now. But in the spring of 1945, I was a young pilot sitting in the cramped, oil-scented cockpit of a Curtiss Helldiver, launched from the deck of a carrier that felt like a tiny, vulnerable speck in the Philippine Sea. We had heard the rumors for years, drifting through the mess decks like smoke. They talked about the super battleship, a monster hidden in the fog of Curry and Truk. We'd seen blurry reconnaissance photos that made our analysts sweat. A hull so wide it shouldn't have been able to move, and guns. God, those guns. 18-inch monsters that could hurl a shell the weight of a sedan over 25 miles. The fascination we felt was laced with a deep, cold anxiety that sat in the pit of our stomachs. We were the new breed of war, the aviators, the kids with silk scarves and grease under our fingernails. But the shadow of the old world, the world of big guns and thick armor, still loomed over us like a thundercloud. The Yamato was a secret kept so well that we didn't even know its true scale until we saw it through our gun sights. It was beautiful in a way that made your heart stop. A sloping, graceful bow that sliced through the Pacific swells and a pagoda mast that reached for the heavens like a temple of war. It was the ultimate statement of naval power, a masterpiece of engineering that had arrived just in time to watch its own world burn to ashes. I remember the silence of the Pacific before the storm. People think of war as a constant roar, but it's the quiet that breaks you. Standing on the flight deck before dawn, you could feel the humidity clinging to your skin, the smell of aviation fuel mixing with the salt spray. We knew something big was moving. The intelligence boys were whispering about Operation Tengo. The Japanese were desperate. They were sending the Yamato on a one-way mission to Okinawa. No air cover, no hope of return. It was a suicide run on a planetary scale. I looked at my plane, a machine of aluminum and rivets, and then thought about the steel plates on that ship, plates over 20 inches thick. It felt like trying to take down a mountain with a swarm of bees. But that was the psychological game of the Yamato. It was designed to make you feel insignificant. It was a monument to the idea that sheer mass could defy the progress of time. But as I strapped into my seat and felt the vibration of the engine through my boots, I realized we weren't just fighting a ship. We were fighting a symbol of an era that refused to die quietly. The fascination with the Yamato wasn't just ours. It was a cult-like obsession within the Japanese Navy itself. They called it Hotel Yamato for a while because it stayed in port so much, a queen too precious to lose. They fed the sailors the best rice, the coldest beer, while the rest of their empire starved. It was a beautiful lie, they told themselves, that as long as Yamato floated, Japan could not fall. I think about those boys on the other side sometimes. They must have felt like gods standing on that deck, surrounded by the greatest armor ever forged. But deep down, in the dark corners of the engine rooms, they must have known They must have seen the planes in the sky and realized that the world had changed while they were building their fortress. The tragedy of the Yamato started long before we dropped a single bomb. It started the moment they decided that a ship could be a god. As we taxied toward the catapult, the sun began to break over the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of blood and gold. We were the executioners, and the giant was waiting for us in the mist, 30-odd miles off the coast of Kyushu. The morning of April 7, 1945, didn't feel like the end of an era. It felt like a heavy, humid weight pressing down on your chest. On the carrier decks of Task Force 58, the atmosphere was thick with a singular, grim purpose. We weren't just prepping for another sortie. We were preparing to hunt a legend. I remember the sound of the mechanics' wrenches hitting the metal, the frantic chatter of the radio operators, and the way the air seemed to hum with static electricity. The word had come down through the wire. The Yamato had left the inland sea. It was no longer a ghost hiding in a protected harbor. It was a physical reality, moving through the East China Sea with the momentum of a falling planet. We stood in the ready rooms, our flight suits damp with sweat, staring at the grainy black and white photos pinned to the boards. The scale of the thing was hard to wrap your head around. It wasn't just a ship, it was a message that said the Empire of Japan would rather see its greatest masterpiece at the bottom of the ocean than surrender it to the tide of history. The psychological weight of Operation Tengo was starting to settle into our bones. We knew the Japanese had no air cover left to give. They were sending the Yamato out with only a handful of destroyers and the light cruiser Yahagi as a screen. It was a suicide mission, a kikusui, or floating chrysanthemum attack. They weren't expecting to win a naval engagement. They were expecting to die in a way that would haunt our nightmares for a century. As an American pilot, it was hard to compute that level of desperation. We fought to come home. They were fighting to become dust. That fascinates you in a dark, twisted way. The idea of 72,000 tons of steel being used as a ceremonial sword for a ritual suicide. I looked at my wingman, a kid from Ohio named Miller, and saw him checking his survival gear over and over. We all knew that even without planes, the Yamato was the most dangerous target on the planet. Its anti-aircraft suite was a forest of barrels, over 150 guns designed to turn the sky into a localized hurricane of shrapnel and flame. The engineering of the Yamato was its own kind of terror. As we briefed on the target's vulnerabilities, the spec sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. Its main armor belt was 16 inches of Vickers hardened steel, angled to deflect the heaviest shells in the world. Its triple-bottom hull was designed to survive torpedo hits that would have snapped a standard cruiser in two. But the most terrifying part, the part that kept us quiet during the briefing, were the Sanshikidan shells, the beehive rounds. We had heard stories of these 18.1-inch projectiles being fired into the air, bursting into thousands of incendiary tubes that created a wall of fire in the sky. It was as if the ship could conjure its own hell. We weren't just flying into a battle. We were flying into a fortress that was designed to swat us out of the air like bothersome flies. The fascination with its power was a constant, low-frequency vibration in our minds, a reminder that one mistake meant you'd be vaporized before you even saw the ship's bow. As the catapults fired and we were flung into the gray, overcast sky, the sense of scale hit me again. Hundreds of us were in the air, Avengers, Helldivers, and Hellcats, stretching out in a massive, coordinated swarm. We were the product of 1,000 factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh, a mechanical hive moving toward a single point in the sea. Below us, the Pacific looked like hammered lead, cold and indifferent. We flew for hours in a tense, buzzing silence, our eyes straining against the haze. We knew the Yamato was out there, steaming at 27 knots, a massive wake trailing behind it like a funeral shroud. The tension was so thick you could taste the copper in your mouth. You start to think about the men on that ship. 3,000 of them. Engineers, gunners, officers, all of them knowing this was their final day on Earth. Did they feel the same fascination we did? Did they look at their massive guns and feel a sense of tragic pride? Or did they look at the horizon and wait for the first sound of our engines with the resignation of the condemned? Then, the radar began to pulse. a massive return. Something so large it didn't look like a ship on the screen. It looked like a landmass. The clouds were low, a thick ceiling of slate gray that forced us down to 3,000 feet. The spray from the whitecaps was hitting our windshields, and then, like a mountain emerging from the fog, we saw it, the Yamato. It was even larger than the photo suggested. It sat deep in the water, its massive hull cutting through the waves with a predatory grace that defied its bulk. Its gray paint was weathered, showing the scars of a long, stagnant war, but its guns were leveled, pointing toward us like the fingers of a vengeful god. The fascination turned into a cold, sharp adrenaline. This was it. The world's largest weapon versus the world's most relentless fleet. The giant was awake, and it was waiting for us to enter its kill zone. The air around the ship began to sparkle with the first bursts of anti-aircraft fire, a deadly welcoming party that told us the ritual had begun. The transition from the tense silence of the flight to the chaotic roar of the battlefield was instantaneous. As we closed the distance, the Yamato didn't just defend itself, it seemed to ignite the very atmosphere. From the cockpit of my Helldiver, I watched the horizon light up with a strobe-like intensity. The Sanshikidan shells, those legendary beehive rounds, began to burst in front of us. They weren't like standard flak. They were beautiful and terrifying, exploding into thousands of incandescent shards that painted the gray sky with streaks of white, red, and yellow fire. It looked like a fireworks display from hell, designed to shred the fabric of our wings and the nerves of our pilots. I felt the vibration of the shockwaves through my control stick, a violent, rhythmic thumping that reminded me just how small my plane was compared to the monster below. The fascination with the ship's power was gone, replaced by a primal, focused instinct for survival. You don't think about history when you're flying through a wall of lead. You think about the next 3 seconds. The psychological weight of the Yamato's presence was physical. As I tilted my plane into a dive, the ship filled my entire windscreen. It was so vast that it distorted my sense of speed and altitude. I could see the individual gun tubs, hundreds of them, each one spitting fire and tracer rounds that curved toward us like lethal glowing ribbons. The Japanese gunners were frantic, their world a screaming kakutas of mechanical noise and desperate commands. We had been briefed to concentrate our hits on the port side. Our commanders knew that even the Yamato couldn't withstand the uneven weight of thousands of tons of water. It was a cold, calculated strategy, a mechanical execution. We weren't trying to blow the ship apart. We were trying to trip it, to make its own massive weight its undoing. The engineering brilliance that had made it so stable was now the very thing we sought to weaponize against it. As the first wave of Avengers dropped their torpedoes, I saw the white trails streaking through the dark water like silver needles. The Yamato was surprisingly agile for its size, its massive rudders kicking up huge plumes of spray as it tried to comb the tracks, turning its bow into the path of the incoming steel. But there were too many of us. For every torpedo it evaded, 3 more were closing in. I saw the first hit, a towering column of white water that erupted against the port bow. The ship shuddered, a visible tremor that seemed to ripple through its entire 860-foot length, but it didn't slow down. It was like watching a titan being stung by a hornet. It was annoyed, but far from defeated. The fascinations of the naval architects who had designed that triple-bottomed hull were being put to the ultimate test, and for a moment it looked like the ship might actually be as unsinkable as the propaganda claimed. The air was thick with the smell of salt, burnt oil, and the metallic tang of spent ammunition. My gunner was screaming over the intercom, his twin .30 calibers rattling as he tried to suppress the anti-aircraft crews below us. I released my 1,000-pound bomb at the nadir of my dive, feeling the plane leap upward as the weight fell away. Looking back over my shoulder, I saw the blast blossom on the Yamato's deck, near the massive pagoda mast. Steel plating that was inches thick buckled like tinfoil. Men were being vaporized in the heat of the explosions, yet the ship's guns never stopped firing. There was a grim, suicidal determination in the way they fought back. They knew there was no air cover coming. They knew the nearest Japanese airfield was hundreds of miles away. They were alone in the middle of a hostile ocean, surrounded by a swarm of mechanical predators, and yet they stood their ground with a ferocity that demanded a terrible kind of respect. By the end of the first half hour, the Yamato was no longer the pristine queen of the fleet. It was starting to bleed. A thick, oily smoke began to pour from its midships, trailing behind it like a black funeral veil. The list to port was slight, maybe 3 or 4 degrees, but it was there. The secret flaw of the battleship era was being exposed in real time. No matter how big the guns, no matter how thick the armor, a ship is a creature of the surface, and we were coming from the sky and the depths. The fascination we felt for this ultimate weapon was being replaced by a somber realization. We were witnessing the agonizing death of a concept. The battleship was dying, and the Yamato was its final, most magnificent martyr. As I pulled out of the combat zone to regroup for a second run, I looked down at the ship one last time. It was still firing. Its 18-inch turrets let out a defiant roar that could be heard even over the sound of my own engine, a dying king refusing to let go of its crown. By the time the second wave of planes arrived, the Yamato was no longer a symbol of imperial dominance. It was a wounded animal fighting a losing battle against gravity and physics. The ocean, which had once been the ship's kingdom, was now its most relentless enemy. From my position, regrouping for another run, I could see the ship's list to port increasing. It was a slow, agonizing tilt, like the hands of a clock counting down to an inevitable midnight. The secret flaw of these gargantuan battleships was becoming painfully apparent. Their complex internal systems were their Achilles heel. Every torpedo that slammed into the port side didn't just tear through steel. It shattered the intricate network of pipes, electrical cables, and communication lines that allowed the ship to function as a single organism. The fascination with the ship's size was now eclipsed by the sheer horror of its vulnerability. It was too big to save, and its massive weight was now working against the very men who had built it to be invincible. Inside the ship, the situation must have been a descent into a mechanical hell. We received intelligence later that the damage control teams were working in waist-deep water, choked by the smell of fuel oil and the screams of the wounded. The fascination of the Japanese engineers with unsinkability had led them to create a ship that refused to die quickly. Because the armor was so thick, the explosions from our bombs were contained within the hull, turning the interior into a series of pressurized blast chambers. I saw a group of Avengers from the Enterprise dive through a gap in the clouds, their torpedoes striking the midsection with surgical precision. The Yamato shuddered violently, a massive gout of black smoke erupting from its secondary battery. The ship was taking on thousands of tons of water every minute, and the pumps, miracles of engineering in their own right, simply couldn't keep up with the Pacific Ocean pouring through the jagged gashes in the hull. The psychological weight on the Japanese officers must have been crushing. Admiral Ito and Captain Ariga were witnessing the slow-motion destruction of the pride of their nation. In a desperate attempt to correct the list, the order was given to counterflood the starboard engine and boiler rooms. It was a brutal, cold-blooded command. It meant intentionally drowning the men working in those compartments to save the ship from capsizing. I think about those engineers often, men who stayed at their posts watching the dark water rise until it touched the hot boilers, knowing that their sacrifice was only buying the ship a few more minutes of life. This was the raw, brutal reality of the Yamato's final hours. The fascination with the samurai spirit was being tested by the cold, hard logic of naval architecture. No amount of courage could stop the water from seeking its level. From the air, the Yamato began to look like a scorched, blackened island. The beautiful pagoda mast was now a twisted forest of charred metal, and the once pristine decks were littered with the debris of shattered gun tubs and spent shell casings. The anti-aircraft fire was starting to slacken. For every 10 guns that had been firing at the start of the battle, only 2 or 3 remained active. The gunners were being wiped out by our strafing runs, their positions exposed and unprotected. Yet, even in this state, the Yamato refused to stop. I watched as one of the massive 18-inch turrets attempted to fire at a group of low-flying torpedo bombers, a desperate, futile gesture, like a giant trying to swat a fly with a sledgehammer. The muzzle flash was blinding, a momentary sun that illuminated the carnage on the deck, but the shell missed, disappearing into the gray waves without effect. The era of the big gun was not just ending. It was being mocked by the agility of the new age. The atmosphere among us pilots was one of grim focus. There was no joy in the destruction, only a sense of inevitable conclusion. We had seen the Bismarck fall in the Atlantic, and now we were watching its Pacific brother follow suit. The fascination we felt for these ships was being replaced by a somber understanding of the cost of war. As the list reached 15 degrees, the Yamato's massive guns became useless. They couldn't be elevated high enough to hit the horizon anymore. The ship was no longer a weapon, it was a target. We were no longer fighting a warship, we were dismantling a monument. Every hit we scored was a nail in the coffin of the battleship era, and as the giant began to slow down, its wake fading into a pathetic ripple, we knew the end was only a matter of time. The ocean was waiting, and the Yamato was finally starting to listen to its call. By 14 hours, the Yamato was no longer a ship, it was a dying planet. The list to port had reached a critical 20 degrees, a point of no return where the very geometry of the vessel turned against its survival. From my cockpit, looking down through the smoke-choked air, I saw the massive red hull, the belly of the beast, rising out of the water like a bloody wound. The fascination we had felt for its stability was now replaced by the terrifying sight of its exposure. The great 18-inch turrets, each weighing more than a full-size destroyer, began to slide off their mountings as the ship tilted further. The sheer mechanical force of those thousands of tons of steel shifting inside the hull created a sound that I could hear even over the roar of my own engine. A deep, tectonic groan of tearing metal that seemed to vibrate through the very water of the East China Sea. The psychological weight on the survivors at this moment is something that haunts my reflections even today. Captain Arriga had reportedly tied himself to the compass stand on the bridge, choosing to go down with his masterpiece, while the crew scrambled over the jagged, oil-slicked remains of the deck. They weren't just losing a battle, they were losing their world. As the list reached 35 degrees, the Yamato finally lost its battle with the Pacific. The ship began to capsize, rolling over like a weary giant seeking rest. But the sea wasn't done with it yet. As the ship turned turtle, the massive 18-inch shells in the forward magazines, projectiles designed to shatter fleets, slid out of their racks. They collided in the darkness of the magazine rooms, and at 14:23, the Yamato delivered its final apocalyptic statement. The explosion was unlike anything I had ever seen, even in the heat of the most brutal Pacific campaigns. It wasn't just a flash, it was a volcanic eruption of fire and pressure that reached 6 kilometers into the sky. A massive, mushroom-shaped cloud of black and purple smoke billowed upward, so powerful that it reportedly knocked several of our own low-flying planes out of the air like they were made of paper. The fascination of the architects with the ship's internal storage had created a localized sun. For a split second, the Yamato was the brightest object on Earth, a pillar of fire that could be seen from the shores of Kyushu over 100 miles away. The shockwave hit my plane like a physical wall, tossing me upward and rattling every rivet in the fuselage. It was the sound of an era being vaporized. In the wake of the blast, a haunting silence descended over the coordinates. Where moments before there had been a 72,000-ton Titan and a screen of destroyers, there was now only a gargantuan, bubbling hole in the ocean. The suction from the sinking hull was so immense that it created a terrifying whirlpool, dragging down debris and screaming men alike into the lightless depths. The secret flaw had reached its ultimate conclusion. The bigger they are, the more violent their end. We circled the area for a few minutes, our fuel gauges running low, looking down at the massive oil slick that was the only remains of the largest battleship ever built. The fascination was gone, replaced by a gaping, hollow awe. We had set out to sink a ship, but it felt like we had witnessed the death of a god. The water was thick with black fuel oil, and the white dots of survivors, tiny specks of life in a vast, indifferent ocean of death. Only 276 men from a crew of over 3,000 would ever see home again. As I banked my helldiver to head back toward the carrier, I looked back one last time. The mushroom cloud was still hanging in the air, a dark monument to the folly of absolute power. The Yamato was gone, falling through 2,000 feet of water to its final resting place, split in two by the force of its own internal fury. We had won the battle, and the road to Japan was now wide open. But the price of that victory was etched in a column of smoke that seemed to touch the very edge of space. The age of the battleship hadn't just ended. It had been buried in a tomb of fire. The flight back to the carrier was the loneliest time I ever spent in a cockpit. The sky, which had been a chaotic theater of fire and flak only an hour before, was now eerily calm. The sun beginning to dip toward a horizon that felt colder than it had that morning. We flew in a ragged formation, the roar of our engines the only sound in a world that suddenly felt too quiet. I looked at the empty seats in our formation. Boys who wouldn't be at dinner tonight, lives traded for the destruction of a steel giant. The fascination with the Yamato had been replaced by a heavy, soul-searching silence. We had done what we were trained to do. We had dismantled the ultimate weapon of the enemy, but in doing so, we had also witnessed the absolute end of 1,000 years of naval tradition. The battleship, the undisputed king of the seas, since the days of wooden hulls and black powder, had been dethroned by a bunch of kids in aluminum planes. In the decades that followed, the Yamato became more than just a shipwreck. It became the world's largest ghost. It stayed hidden in the darkness of the East China Sea for 39 years before its final resting place was discovered. When the first cameras finally reached the bottom 340 meters down, they didn't find a ship. They found a graveyard of shattered dreams. The hull lies in two massive pieces, separated by the force of that final cataclysmic explosion. The secret flaw of the Yamato wasn't in its design or its armor, it was in its purpose. It was a 20th century ship built for a 19th century war. It was a monument to the arrogance of thinking that size could defeat time. Even now, looking at the underwater footage of those massive 18-inch barrels half buried in the silt, I don't feel triumph. I feel a profound sense of tragedy. All that genius, all that labor, and all those thousands of young lives sacrificed for a symbol that had no place in the world we were building. I often think about the men who went down with her. They were sailors, just like us. They loved their ship with a fierce, desperate loyalty, believing until the very last second that their Titan would protect them. The psychological weight of the Yamato's fall didn't just break the Imperial Japanese Navy, it broke the heart of a nation. It proved that no fortress is truly unsinkable, and no empire is truly eternal. The fascination remains, of course. People still build models of her, write books about her, and wonder what if. But the reality is much simpler and much more brutal. The Yamato was a ghost long before it sank. It was a relic of a dying era, a beautiful, terrifying dinosaur that didn't realize the world had already moved on. The fire that consumed it was the forge of a new age, the age of the aircraft carrier, the missile, and eventually, the nuclear shadow. The sea has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of history. Today, the water over the wreck is as blue and indifferent as it was on that April afternoon in 1945. The oil slicks are gone, the smoke has long since cleared, and the screams are buried under millions of tons of salt water. But for those of us who were there, the Yamato never truly disappeared. It remains a warning about the limits of human power and the danger of building our identity on the strength of our weapons. We won the war, and we came home to build a new world. But we left a piece of our souls out there, circling that mushroom cloud. The giant is silent now, a cathedral of rust and regret, reminding us that even the mightiest can fall if they refuse to see the changing wind. If this journey into the heart of the Pacific and the tragic end of the world's greatest battleship has moved you, or if you've learned something new about the thin line between grandeur and catastrophe, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is the fuel that allows us to keep these stories from being swallowed by the tides of time. History is a conversation between the past and the present, and we want you to be a part of it. Comment below with your impressions. Do you believe the Yamato was a masterpiece of engineering or a massive waste of resources? What other ghosts of the deep should we investigate next? Let's keep the memory of these titans alive together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next horizon.